Welcome back, everyone. For this deep dive, we've got something really special planned.
Yeah, we're going to take a look back at the first 7 deep dives that we've done.
Right. And so we've covered a lot of ground already, and I think it's time to step back and kind of look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
So for those of you who maybe haven't heard all 7 of the previous episodes, what we've been doing is looking at some newly declassified documents related to the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
And we've been going through them pretty meticulously, picking out, some of the interesting stuff that we're finding in there and really trying to look at it kind of with a fresh perspective. And so now we're at a point where we can sort of synthesize some of that stuff and see what the bigger picture looks like.
Yeah, and maybe start to tease out, if there are any correlations between these documents.
Yeah, exactly.
And how they might point us toward an answer.
Yeah, what they might tell us about who was behind the assassination. So, you up for that?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, great. So what we've got in front of us is literally like a mountain of paper.
Yeah.
Because we've been through so many documents, but we've kind of pulled out some of the highlights from each of those first 7 episodes. Yeah. We're going to go through them chronologically by the date of the document.
All right, that sounds good.
Okay, so that should be fun. I think that will give us an interesting perspective on...
Yeah, I think so.
...on how this all unfolds. Okay. So let's jump in. I guess the first document that we have is from January 18, 1952.
Okay.
And this was from episode 6, and it was a sensitive security information message.
Right.
What does this early document reveal in terms of, our bigger inquiry?
Well, this document, it details a request to the Research Institute of America.
Okay.
Or RAIA, for a cover case. For an individual named Rose.
Okay. And
it involved a couple of interesting figures, Leo Chern and Carl H. Pforzheimer.
Okay, so a cover case meaning like a fake backstory, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And, in the early Cold War, establishing these kinds of believable backgrounds was pretty routine.
Sure.
For, people involved in intelligence work.
Right, this is like the spy versus spy days.
Yeah, exactly.
The Cold War is really heating up.
Right. Okay. And so this document... although it's from a decade before the assassination, it shows us, these established procedures for how they created and managed these clandestine identities.
Okay.
Which is like a foundational element of intelligence operations.
Right.
That could have certainly, been in play in more complex scenarios later on.
Interesting. Okay, so even though this document isn't directly related to the JFK assassination, it gives us a glimpse into how intelligence agencies were operating at that time.
Absolutely.
And what kind of techniques they were using.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. All right, so let's move on then to the next document, which is from May 14, 1955. And this was also from episode 6, and it was a dispatch that involved sending copies of something called HALT reports.
HALT reports, right?
Yeah.
These covered late 1954 and early 1955.
Okay.
And they were meant to be compiled into a bigger master report.
Okay, so what is the takeaway here? I mean, is there anything in those HALT reports that relates to the assassination, or is it more about...
Not specifically about the assassination.
Okay.
But what's striking is just a massive scale of routine intelligence gathering and analysis that was going on.
Okay.
It gives you a sense of, the huge volume of information that the agencies were dealing with long before Kennedy was even president.
Okay, so they're just scooping up everything they can get their hands on.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sure, right.
It's a fire hose of information.
Okay, so it doesn't tell us anything specific about the assassination, but it does paint a picture of the intelligence landscape at the time.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, all right, let's move on to the next document then, which is from February 1st, 1956. And this was, again, from episode 6, and it was an operational and source cover sheet.
Right.
And this one just seemed like paperwork. But what was significant about this particular document?
Well, this one, it outlined administrative details.
Okay.
For a report that was coming out of San Jose, Costa Rica.
Okay.
And, it might seem kind of mundane.
Sure.
But it actually highlights the standard procedures for how they handle intelligence reports.
Okay.
Including, the really important part of protecting sources.
Right.
And maintaining operational security.
Okay.
Even in, what might seem like less critical areas.
Okay.
So these established protocols, they would have been in place for all kinds of activities.
Right.
Potentially, including those related to Cuba in the years leading up to 1963.
Okay, so again, this is kind of setting the stage, showing us how the intelligence agencies were working and what their priorities were. Okay, all right, let's move on then to a document from October 20, 1959. And this was from episode 1, and it was a secret memorandum that summarized a recorded conversation that took place in Miami.
Okay.
What did we learn from this memo?
Well, this memo, it summarized a conversation between William D. Pauley and some unidentified Cubans. And they were discussing anti-Castro efforts and the economic situation in Cuba.
Okay, so now we're starting to get a little bit closer.
Yeah, this is where we start to see some, direct relevance to the assassination. It provides a glimpse into, the anti-Castro sentiment that was brewing at the time and the active organizing that was happening within the Cuban exile community. And those are elements that would become very much intertwined with the events leading up to November 1963.
Right. Okay, so we're starting to see some of the players emerge here.
Exactly.
All right, well, let's move on to the next document, which is from September 20th, 1960. And this was from episode 5, and it was a secret memorandum about something called Project EST to Cal.
Project EST to Cal, yeah.
Okay, what was that all about?
This memorandum detailed Project EST to Cal, which was a CIA audio surveillance operation. And it was targeting the new China News Agency in Havana. And it ran for over a year, from May 1959 to August 1960. So this shows, just how much attention the CIA was paying Cuba at the time. It highlights their deep interest in monitoring the communist regime and its international connections. And you can imagine that this kind of extensive surveillance infrastructure and that mindset, it was definitely in place. As tensions with Cuba continued to escalate.
In the early 60s, yeah. Okay, so Project EST to Cal is a good example of the kind of intelligence gathering that was going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
In relation to Cuba. Now, there's another document from that same day, September 20, 1960, also from episode 5, and this one had to do with sectional aeronautical charts.
Yes.
What did this document reveal?
Well, this document, it's a task organization. And it outlines the logistics for an unspecified operation involving the 1045 Operational Evaluation and Training Group. And what's interesting here is that it specifically mentions sanitization and contingency plans.
Interesting.
So this shows you the level of detail involved in operational planning. Even for, activities that we don't have the full context for. It suggests a culture of thoroughness and preparation within the agency.
So they're very meticulous about covering their tracks.
Yeah, very much so. Always thinking about what could go wrong. And how to handle it.
Interesting. All right, so that takes us to November of 1960. Specifically November 10th. And we have a name check and consolidation request form from that date from episode 1, who is being tracked here.
Well, this form, it gives us information on a Soviet citizen named Roman Fedorovich Dedkov and his wife. They were applying for visas to India. And during the Cold War, tracking Soviet citizens, especially those traveling internationally, was standard practice. So this just underscores, that global reach of these intelligence concerns. And the constant vigilance toward, potential Soviet activities.
So they're keeping an eye on everyone who's moving around.
Yeah, pretty much. Anyone who might be a person of interest. All
right, so let's move on to the next document, which is from August 6, 1961. And this was Secret Report S-153 from Israeli intelligence. And this was from episode 6. What kind of information did this report contain?
Well, this report, it listed individuals that were connected to the International Institute for Peace in several Latin American countries, including Cuba and Mexico. So it reveals a pattern of surveillance, targeting individuals and groups that were perceived as having leftist leanings in that region. And, it suggests a broad intelligence effort to monitor this potential communist influence. Which would certainly included people and organizations sympathetic to Castro's Cuba.
All right. So this is starting to show us a bit more about the intelligence community's interest in Cuba and individuals who might be sympathetic to Castro. Okay, great. So now we've got a document from December 4, 1961. And this one was about a meeting with a guy named Plinio Priosakaras.
Plinio Priosakaras.
Yeah, this was from episode 6, Who was he and why was he of interest?
Well, he was a Cuban exile in Miami.
Okay.
Who was really active in the anti-Castro movement.
Okay.
And this report, it details a meeting with him focusing on his background and his political views.
Okay.
It gives us a glimpse into, the activities and the perspectives of the Cuban exile community in the U.S.
Right.
Which, this was a community that really harbored intense animosity towards Castro.
Right.
And had a number of connections to U.S. intelligence agencies.
Okay, so again, we're seeing more of these potential players emerge.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right, so let's move on then to a document from February 7, 1962.
Okay.
And this was a secret dispatch regarding Antonio Rodriguez Acau.
Right.
And this was from episode 2. What was the key takeaway from this dispatch?
Well, this dispatch, it reports on Antonio Rodriguez Acau.
Okay.
And it notes that a report about him was given to something called Union 11.
Union 11, okay.
And it requests the results of a debriefing. So this indicates that there was, ongoing surveillance of people who were suspected of having connections to Cuba.
Right.
So again, it reinforces this intense intelligence focus on Cuban-related activities.
During this period, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, let's keep moving forward then.
All right.
August 31st, 1962, we've got a secret sensitive memorandum that discusses Cuban refugee groups in Cleveland, Ohio. And this was from episode 5. Why were these groups of interest to U.S. intelligence?
So this memo, it discusses 2 Cuban refugee groups in Cleveland.
Okay.
And one of these groups was suspected of gathering medical supplies and personnel that were potentially destined for Cuba. And this prompted an investigation by a special group in Washington. So it reveals that even these, seemingly humanitarian activities within the U.S. were subject to scrutiny if they had any possible link to Castro's regime. So it illustrates, just how deep this U.S. concern ran and how extensive this domestic monitoring related to Cuba was.
Right, so anyone who had any connection to Cuba whatsoever was on their radar.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Wow, okay. All right, so now we're into 1963.
Okay.
January 9th, we've got a dispatch from JM Wave, which was the CIA station in Miami.
Right.
And this was about M. Cutler 1 and Mutana operations.
Mutana operations, yeah.
This was from episode 7. What did this reveal about the anti-Castro efforts that were going on?
So this dispatch, it details support for Mutana operations, which involved anti-Castro Cuban exiles. It mentions interviews with 7 Cubans. And the use of pouch passes.
Pouch passes.
Yeah, through the Brazilian consulate in Havana. So this, paints a picture of intensified clandestine U.S. support for these anti-Castro activities in the months leading up to the assassination.
So things are really starting to heat up at this point.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's move on to a document from May 25, 1963. This is a dispatch from Mexico City, and it mentioned an individual named Yabo Ascu and a speech on non-intervention.
Right.
This was from episode 6. Why was this information documented?
Well, this dispatch contains a contact report mentioning Yabo Ascu, who was expected to return to Mexico, and a speech at the Academia Mexicana del Derecho Internacionalist on non-intervention and self-determination, which was, a typical Mexican policy towards Cuba.
Right.
And while it's not directly about Oswald, this document, it provides context for his later trip to Mexico City. It shows us, the political climate in a place where Oswald would soon try to obtain visas to Cuba and the Soviet Union.
So it's setting the stage for Oswald's appearance in Mexico City.
All right.
So now we have a dispatch from July 11, 1963. And this one concerns a CBIN agent codenamed Amon 1.
Amon 1.
Yeah, and this was from episodes 4 and 7. What did this tell us about the intelligence operations going on inside Cuba?
Well, this dispatch, it's addressed to the chief of Task Force W. And it details the activities of this CBIN agent, Amon 1. He'd been recruited by JMWE. And was operating inside Cuba with a network connected to Cuban Airlines.
Wow.
And the dispatch raises concerns about his safety, which reveals, the risk and the extent of U.S. intelligence penetration inside Cuba just a few months before the assassination.
So they're really trying to get eyes and ears on the ground in Cuba.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So now we come to July 17th and 29th, 1963. This is a secret dispatch from the chief of station in Mexico City.
Right.
And it reports contact with an individual codenamed LNL9.
LNL9?
Yeah, and this was from episode 2, Who was LNL9? And why was this contact so significant?
Well, LNL9 was the CIA cryptonym for Lee Harvey Oswald. And this dispatch reports contact with him in Mexico City on those dates.
Okay.
And this is, a pretty big deal.
Right.
Because it places Oswald in contact with individuals that were being monitored by the CIA in a location that he visited shortly before the assassination.
Right.
So it raises questions about, what was the nature of this contact?
Right.
What information did the agency have on Oswald at this time, and what actions did they take based on that information?
Yeah. I mean, this is really a smoking gun, isn't it?
It's definitely significant.
Yeah. Okay, so then the very next day, July 18th, 1963, we have a secret memorandum, also from the chief of station in Mexico City, specifically concerning Lee Henry Oswald.
Lee Henry Oswald, right?
Yeah.
This was covered in episode 2.
Yes. Right. And what details does this memo contain?
Well, this memo, it details Oswald's visit to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City on July 17th.
Go ahead.
It mentions that he was seeking a visa to the Soviet Union via Cuba.
Okay.
And it also highlights his stated support for Fidel Castro.
Okay.
And his involvement with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Right.
So this document provides like a firsthand account from the CIA's perspective of Oswald's intentions and his political leanings right before the assassination.
Right.
And it confirms that, the agency was aware of his attempts to travel to Cuba and his pro-Castro sympathies.
Okay, so this is really starting to build a picture of Oswald as someone who was on the CIA's radar.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, let's move forward a bit
Fine.
to September 30, 1964.
Okay.
And this was a classified message titled Oswald Assassin or Fall Guy.
Yeah, interesting title.
Yeah, and this was from episode 1. What does this message reveal about the post-assassination investigation?
Well, this message was sent from the director of the CIA to various European stations, and it reported incorrectly that Oswald had joined the German Communist Party in 1932.
Wow.
And had a fiancée named Anna Shinsky.
Okay.
And it requested a background check and photographs.
Okay.
So this highlights the chaotic and sometimes inaccurate information that was circulating in the intelligence community right after the assassination.
Okay.
It shows the pressure to quickly understand Oswald's background and his potential connections, even if it meant spreading wrong information.
Wow. So they're really scrambling to put the pieces together?
Yeah, they're grasping at straws a little bit.
Wow. Okay. All right. So now we come to December 23, 1964.
Okay.
This is a secret dispatch from the chief of CERNA.
CERNA. Okay.
Yeah. And it concerns the Warren Commission testimony of high-ranking CIA officers.
Interesting.
This was from episode 1. What was the focus of this dispatch?
Well, this dispatch, it was addressed to all chiefs of station.
Okay.
And it discussed this heightened focus on presidential protection.
Okay.
After the assassination.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it had attached excerpts of Warren Commission testimony from these high-ranking CIA officials.
Okay.
So it shows, the agency's involvement in the official inquiry.
Right.
And their internal communication regarding, the security implications of the assassination.
Okay. So they're definitely trying to control the narrative here.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to manage the situation.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to March 19, 1968. We have a dispatch from JM Wave about an individual resembling journalist Carlos Bringuier.
Carlos Bringuier.
Yeah.
He had that public confrontation with Oswald in New Orleans.
That's right.
And this is from episode 7.
Okay.
The code name was M-Carbon 1.
Okay. What was the agency's interest in this guy?
So M-Carbon 1, resembled Carlos Bringuier.
Okay.
And it detailed some security concerns.
Okay.
But also expressed interest in Bringuier's media contacts. Potentially for disseminating, surface-selected propaganda items.
Okay.
Which is interesting because it connects someone who had a pre-assassination encounter with Oswald to CIA interests.
Okay, so they're looking to use Bringuier.
Potentially, yeah.
To spread their message.
Okay.
All right, so now we've got April 18th, 1968.
Okay.
Episode 6 featured a cable providing information about Eric Starvo-Gault.
Eric Starvo-Gault, okay.
The alias used by James Earl Ray.
Right, the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr.
exactly why is this information found within the JFK files?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So this cable, it provides information about Galt.
Okay.
Including a physical description and his last known whereabouts.
Okay.
And it tasks a check for the reliability of the information.
Okay.
And, the fact that we have details about James Earl Ray in the JFK files suggests that during this time of intense scrutiny of political assassinations, there was an awareness of potential connections or overlapping intelligence interests related to high-profile figures that were targets of violence.
Interesting. Okay, so they're seeing potential links between these different events.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Okay. All right, so June 3, 1968.
Okay.
We have a dispatch concerning something called Project Lion Tour.
Project Lion Tour.
Yeah, and this was a leftist writer press service in Mexico.
Interesting.
This was from episode 6. What does this tell us about the CIA's continued activities in Mexico?
So this dispatch, it details Project Lion Tour. It outlines their publications. Their efforts to become more effective.
Okay.
And mentions of the Excelsior newspaper.
Okay.
And critical press coverage in Mexico.
Okay.
So it shows that even years after the assassination, the CIA was still very much interested in monitoring and potentially influencing leftist media and political discourse in Mexico.
Right.
A country with known connections to Oswald.
Right, exactly. Okay, so they're not letting up on their interest in Mexico.
Nope.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
We've gone through a lot of documents chronologically from the first 7 deep dives.
Right.
What are some of the overarching themes or connections?
Well, one thing that's very clear is the CIA's intense focus on Cuba. This predates the assassination by years. Yeah, and continues immediately afterwards.
Right.
You see these operations against Castro, surveillance of both pro and anti-Castro groups, including Cuban exiles in the U.S., and a clear concern about potential Cuban involvement in Kennedy's death.
Okay, so Cuba is definitely front and center in all of this.
Absolutely.
Okay, and what about Oswald himself?
Well, the documents from July 1963 in Mexico City, they're really crucial.
Okay.
They show that the CIA was aware of Oswald, his pro-Castro leanings, and his attempts to travel to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Just months before the assassination, they were tracking him using a code name. So this raises questions about, what the agency knew, what they did with that information, and whether that information was shared with other parts of the government.
Right, because if they knew about Oswald and his potential for violence, why didn't they do anything to stop him?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Yeah.
And, we don't have the answer to that yet.
Right.
But it's certainly something that needs further investigation.
Okay. Beyond Cuba and Oswald, are there any other patterns or areas of interest that stand out to you?
We also see the agency's ongoing efforts to understand the events.
Okay.
They're monitoring individuals connected to Oswald.
Right.
Like de Mohrenschildt and Bringuier. And they're even considering the possibility of foreign disinformation, specifically from the Soviet Union. And then the fact that we have these documents related to domestic surveillance programs, like MHCA-OS, and even information about James Earl Ray, suggests a broader interest in the political and social unrest of the 1960s.
Okay.
And potential connections between, different events and individuals during that time.
Okay, so it sounds like we're really just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay. But based on what we've seen so far, does this data set point us to any conclusions about who might have been behind the assassination?
Well, no single document gives us a definitive answer. But collectively, this information paints a picture of a U.S. intelligence apparatus that's deeply engaged in covert operations. Extensive surveillance, both domestically and internationally, and a keen interest in anyone connected to the events in Dallas. And considering that pre-assassination focus on Cuba and their awareness of Oswald's activities, it's impossible to rule out the involvement of anti-Castro Cuban exiles, some of whom may have had ties to the CIA. Similarly, the agency's monitoring of pro-Castro elements suggests they were aware of people with potential motivations. The post-assassination scrutiny of Oswald's connections and the consideration of Soviet disinformation indicates that, foreign actors were also on their radar.
Right.
And given what we know about domestic surveillance programs,
right.
the possibility of rogue elements within U.S. intelligence agencies themselves can't be ignored.
Right. So there are a lot of possibilities here. Okay. And it sounds like we're moving away from this lone gunman theory.
Well, the official investigations,
right.
they identified Oswald as the shooter.
Right.
But these documents reveal a complex web of intelligence activities, pre-assassination awareness of Oswald, and a wide range of potential actors and motivations linked to the political tensions of the era.
Right.
So the data, it strongly suggests that the full story is much more complicated than just a lone gunman.
Okay. Well, that's a lot to think about.
It is.
But I think it's been a really helpful exercise to go through these documents chronologically.
Yeah, I agree.
And to see how they all connect. So I want to thank you for guiding us through this.
You're welcome.
And for all of your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And I want to thank all of you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
I hope this has given you some new things to think about. And I encourage you to go back and listen to the first 7 episodes.
Yeah.